If life was perfect, we'd not need poetry. You wouldn't need to be delighted, enthused, stimulated by poetry, because life would constantly be full of pleasurable excitements and so on.
Former English teacher, university lecturer and exam board moderator, Peter Thomas just loves poetry.
Or if life made sense, we'd not need poetry, you know. But sometimes life doesn't. It's perplexing and confusing and it's ambiguous, so poetry sometimes makes sense of things. I have poetry books downstairs, upstairs, in the loo, and poetry offers me the ability within perhaps 2 or 3 minutes worth of reading to be surprised, delighted, to be provoked, or to revisit territory that I know very well, to go back to familiar, sometimes nostalgic. And it's the concentrated power of language and thought and feeling and ideas that you can get in 14 lines of poems, even less, 5 lines. So it's the potency wrapped up in a very small package. That's what I like about it. But beyond that, I like the fact that it can be shared, noisily, loudly. I like collaborative doing of poems rather than private reading of poems.
You got boys and girls. And the boys, because the boys are manly, they make more noise. But these days, girls don't understand that, so they'll make more noise. So there's all sorts of reasons for giving them an aspect of competition.
I had an English teacher who made me excited by words and rhythms. He so loved the subject and he read it with such vigour and enthusiasm that I thought, I'd like some of that. So thank you to that lovely man, who these days wouldn't be regarded as a successful teacher by Ofsted standards. But he was inspirational, committed, devoted, and probably the biggest influence on my life. So we need to remember what poetry is. Poetry is something that erupts into the public domain when somebody has been moved by experience or understanding to say, yes, this is what I want to say.
These days, Peter shares his poetic passion at CPD events, like this one organised for secondary and middle school teachers by Suffolk County Council. He knows teaching poetry can be challenging, but wants to inspire delegates' future lessons with his enthusiastic approach.
One other thing, apart from failing to teach the possessive apostrophe, that unites us all, it's that moment when suspicious kids say to us, go on, tell us what it really means. I suppose that's what I'm worried about. Where does all that come from? Where do the kids pick up the wrong ideas about poetry? Do they pick them up from home? They don't pick them up from the chip shop. Where do they pick them up from? Do they pick them up from us? Because sometimes we are frightened to address poetry directly. There are 3 major obstacles to the successful teaching and experience of poetry. The first one, sadly, is that some English teachers don't themselves read or enjoy poetry, and yet they teach it. If you don't like poetry, it may be because you've read the wrong stuff, or you were exposed to bad poetry teaching. The second reason is the pattern over the last few years where various literacy strategies have put an emphasis upon the mechanistic identification of language features. And it has resulted in a joyless experience of poetry because the poetry is secondary to the literacy objectives specified. And I understand if you're 16 and if you learned how to spell onomatopoeia, you're bloody well going to use it, aren't you? And if you've picked up this exotic thing that you'd never mention outside the off-licence on Friday night when you were with your mates on jambement, you're going to use that one as well, aren't you? Particularly if you say, in this poem, I cannot find any enjambement. The third major obstacle, I have to admit, is it's youngsters. They come with a suspicion that it's flowery, it's girly stuff, it's head in the air, it's got no reality about it. The last thing most teenagers would do is choose voluntarily outside school to read poetry. The necessary thing for me is to make them encounter poems, engage with poems, without necessarily all of those educational trappings and expectations that sometimes block the experience. Hence, doing poetry rather than reading or studying poetry. 1, 2, 3.
Poetry is sexy, its lyrics ain't to please. Poetry is sexy, engaging in its tease. Poetry is sexy, it radiates with
Getting kids to see that a poem has been cleverly crafted is good for me. I like that. But the first thing is they have to enjoy it. And if they don't enjoy it, then whatever they say about it will be lacking in authenticity and sincerity.
In the 3 other films in this series, Peter will share some of his favourite techniques for inspiring poetry lessons.